My name is Lilly Tuttle. I'm the curator of this gallery called At Home in New York. And the two objects I'll be talking about today are together in a section of the exhibition called Managing Space. The first object is a photograph by Eleanor Carucci, and it's an image of her daughter Emma in her bedroom, really during some of the worst moments of the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. The second image is a drawing from the book Little Elliot, Big City by Mike Curator, which is about an elephant who is very small in a very big city, and he lives in a very large apartment that sometimes feels overwhelming and challenging for him. I chose the Eleanor Carucci photograph because I felt that she really captured the claustrophobia and the isolation that was such a part of that experience of living in New York in the spring of 2020. I think for a lot of New Yorkers, 2020 really brought home the reality and the challenges of the small spaces that we sometimes live in, but the ways in which her daughter had also made the space her own. That for a teenager, your bedroom can be very important. It's a very personal space, and I think that teenage bedrooms took on a really particular significance during those really difficult days of the pandemic. I think we wanted to have photographs that showed real New Yorkers living their real lives in apartments or in their homes. Much of this exhibition in this space is about sort of the whimsy or the fantasy of New York homes, whether it's Eloise at the Plaza or, Rosemary's Baby at the Dakota, but I felt that it was good to have a really grounding moment, and this photograph by Eleanor Carucci really kind of brings you back to something that happened quite recently in New York City that I think most people who come through this exhibition will have a connection to, and it will sort of resonate on a personal level. And I thought that it was a nice counterpoint to some of the kind of fantastical fictional representations of New York homes. So the exhibition as a whole looks at what it means to live in New York City. New Yorkers live in a very distinctive way. The density of our city means that very often we live in smaller spaces. We live on top of each other. We live next to each other. We can hear each other. There are a lot of common spaces that we encounter, hallways, elevators, laundry rooms. And so just the idea of kind of the inherent challenges to living in New York have been such rich fodder for so many creative endeavors, whether it's Seinfeld or the Honeymooners or the Jeffersons on TV, but then, the fantasy of Eloise at the Plaza or books like Harriet the Spy. So we really wanted to layer in sort of, the good, the bad, and the ugly of living in New York City. And what I thought this photograph did was take a very specific historic moment in time, really an unprecedented moment in New York City history, and give us that domestic sphere, but then in the context of recent history that so many people can relate to. The drawing from Little Elliot, Big City, the little elephant who is struggling in his apartment and struggling in the city, is really about what it's like to be in a city that's so big when you're so small. And it's a children's book, but what it allows is sort of an empathy and a connection, perhaps, with the child reader who may also be able to relate with the experience of being very small. And so what this book plays with is the challenges of living in New York, but with sort of the scale inverted from what we usually see. Typically, the depictions of New York are of how tiny things are, of how squashed the spaces are. In this one, it's the opposite, that the New Yorker is really tiny, but the space is huge, and that's the challenge. And so you see him standing up on a chair to get some ice cream out of his freezer, or taking a bubble bath in the sink with his dishes. And then there are other parts of the book where he's riding the subway or walking through Central Park, and the city just dwarfs him. So, it's a funny paradox where New York is sort of big and small at the same time. So it kind of plays with this idea of scale and of just sort of the inherent challenge of a city as dense as New York City. And I was captivated as we were thinking about home to bring in this idea of a home that's too big. Sort of the surprise, paradoxical view of home in New York. And to be honest, When we were first thinking about this space as being a gallery dedicated to home, and thinking about what would be the source material for that, I really did sort of initially gravitate towards children's books, because kids have a small world. They don't, they don't have a great sort of vista or perspective out on the world. And so to write a children's book about home is something that they can relate to. Their homes are kind of their whole world. So there are a lot of really great kids' books that focus on homes in New York City. We have a lot of them on view in this exhibition, but Little Elliot really struck me. So this idea of feeling like perhaps you don't fit in, perhaps the city is a little bit big for you and all you really want is a good friend. And that sort of force of alienation and loneliness, and it's frankly a theme that comes up throughout the exhibition. Feeling alone, feeling sort of what it means to be in a crowd. And so I felt like there was something in this book that really captured the energy of New York City, but in unexpected ways. So the process of getting this object was pretty simple, which was that Mike Curator is a pretty prolific children's book author, and we reached out to him and explained that the museum was putting together this exhibition and that there would be a gallery called At Home in New York. And Little Elliot just felt like a perfect way to sort of capture that experience of domesticity in New York and some of the real challenges that people face when making homes in the city. And he was really enthusiastic. He felt like that was a great way to represent his work, and he was honored to be involved. And so it was a really simple, positive process working with him, as it was with all the artists in this gallery. Well, I think when you bring different objects into the same space and you let them talk to each other, you can kind of also take a step back, figuratively and literally, and somehow I think these artistic interpretations and these impressions of the city can kind of give you an overall sense of what does the city mean. That we're not really trying to narrate the city here, we're trying to give you a sense of how does it feel, what does it mean, what have artists said about it. And I think when you look at home, there are these big themes that come out, and that was how we organized the gallery. It sort of helps kind of build a picture of what is sort of the artist's representation of home in New York. And so I think if you can have something like the small space and the big space, and the fact that both of those have an element of struggle and tension to them, it brings you closer to some kind of understanding of the home as a subject for artists looking at New York City.